In this section, we're going to discuss collaborating classes and the associations between objects of different classes. Consider an association like a work relationship where a client and a vendor exist independently and do things not related to each other, but they do come together at certain points to perform business functions. A vendor may advertise certain products, the client shows interest, they talk and make a deal about providing those parts or services. They perform that contract, they pay, they're done. They've collaborated, yet they're two fairly separate entities that do many other things not associated with each other. When these types of objects interact, their association is often loose. That is, they talk to each other for a certain period of time, but outside of that period, they don't have any association. In cases like this, the two different objects talking could in fact change over time. A client could talk to multiple vendors. He's still talking to a vendor. It's just which vendor and what products or services that vendor offers may change. But for the client to build his product, he may need multiple vendors, and he would treat them roughly the same way. In software, we would try to insist that they all be treated exactly the same way, a consistent interface. Unless otherwise specified, associations allow both objects to see and interact with each other. In our vendor-client case, the vendor would have to communicate to the client plus receive information back. Same with the client to the vendor. An association is often represented by declaring a data member reference variable with the type of the other class. This is called composition generally. The one class has a relationship with the other, which is modeled by that instance variable. In this case, since both objects talk to each other, both would have a reference variable to the other. They would be set as to which objects were talking by some method calls. They would communicate, and then that instance variable could be set to null, perhaps, to indicate that that association no longer exists. Aggregation is a different type of association. It has with it the idea of ownership. The owning object often is responsible for the creation and initialization of the owned object. The owned object exists for that time for the benefit of the owner. When it's finished its usefulness, it may be destroyed and the relationship is over. There are times when owned objects exist independently of the owner, but the owner will use them typically exclusively for a period of time. No one else during that period of time can use them. A quick example of that would be a printer in an office. While many people can use it, the printer should be printing at a given time only one person's information. Otherwise, the information would get interleaved and pages from different users would be physically located together, requiring humans to separate them or have pages with half data from one user, half data for another, which would be a mess. So the printer would be temporarily owned exclusively by one user. When finished, it would be released. The next person would own it for his purpose to print his job. An aggregated object is generally managed by the owning object and is dependent upon the owner's lifetime. If the owner object disappears, so does that aggregated or owned object. Composition is looser typically, but knowing when to choose one over the other takes time and skill, depends on the problem. The semantics of ownership, initialization, use, etc. is fairly complicated and takes time to learn. So if it's not clear, that's okay. Take some time to learn it. The main distinction between aggregation and composition is whether or not the object is owned partially, entirely by the owner, and whether the owner has responsibility for managing it. If yes, aggregation; if no, composition. And sometimes, of course, there'll be some sort of a variation between the two, like the printer example. You own it for a period of time, then you release it. Is that aggregation or composition? Aggregation because of ownership, but it's composition in that it's a loose connection. You may have it, you may not have it. It has characteristics of both. Again, this takes time to learn, and we don't always get it right the first time.